Hey guys, it's Malthor here once again. I got a pretty large video here today because in one video, will be squeezing in the introduction, conclusion, and endgame, as well as the full guide of this Poet's Pen Pathfinder character in all right now. So this is a Poet's Pen character using two Poet's Pen wands, and it's a Pathfinder using Glacial Cascade, Bladefall, and another Glacial Cascade. Now the idea behind Poet's Pens is you have a socketed spell inside the wand itself, and anytime you attack with a skill using that wand, so default attack, frenzy, whatever it is, you will be casting the triggered spell. And in this case I have one Cascade in a Poet's Pen and one Bladefall in a Poet's Pen. Now it has taken me, a good couple months to make a Poet's Pen character, and that's because I really desperately didn't want to affect the economy throughout the entire league for this item, because if I did, then it would have gone up by 2-3 times because of all the dirty bastard flippers out there who just buy this shit in anticipation of my videos and then try and resell them, and that would have really hurt everyone's enjoyment of this sort of character, or item in general. So I'd really just tried to avoid it as long as I could, and it shouldn't really matter anymore at the end of the league now. So here's my character, here's my video for it, and overall it's a really fun item. It's a really strong character. It was probably one of the strongest endgame characters I've performed or done this league. DPS pretty similar to that of the Magma Orb and the Blade Flurry, probably a bit worse, but it is safer in some contexts and some playstyles. I died maybe, a couple of times on this character throughout the endgame process, all the way from level 1. It's very possibly hardcore viable if you want to take it that way, and it's just a very strong character overall because of the pure range aspect of it, the high single target, the strong clear speed, the strong movement speed, and being able to freeze things in place quite often really does help a lot. So it's a very strong character overall, and the defenses even aren't terrible. I got something like 40%, maybe 50% evasion with acro, and like I said, freezing everything. You get a decent amount of leech from Warlords Mark and then the Atziri Flask. If you run a Taste of Hate, which I did for the last couple of levels of the character, then once again you get even more defense because Pathfinder scales that quite nicely. So it was a very solid character overall, and the choices I made for Bladefall and Glacial Cascade were ones that I really, when I first saw the item, I thought physical scaling was going to be the way to go, with a bit of conversion or additional damage from spells like a Hatred or some of the new Shaper stuff, and that's the way I decided to take it. So I originally would have thought an Inquisitor's probably best for the full conversion and the penetration of the resist, but Pathfinder just made a bit more sense for the playstyle, given you can't really have a movement skill in the build at all. You just have to run around and do shit. And this here is my first attempt at Guardians. It was a Phoenix with some pretty nasty mods, and since I run Conk Effect in all of my skills for single target, it is a bit tricky to kill the Phoenixes as well as the Phoenix without dying for the most part, but got through it, got through all the Guardians, did a couple of rounds of Guardians and Shaper and Uber Atziri, deathless, and you can definitely level through the Guardians and Guardian maps without worrying about your XP for the most part. But it does get a bit tricky at times if you have some bad mods on those Guardian maps and all that. And this is an example of my purest, highest DPS when I managed to take out my Quicksilver and put on a Wise Oak. So I have 4 DPS flasks in that sense, and that's when I can do some serious damage with the Glacial Cascades for the most part. The Bladefall does help, but it's largely there for the clear as well. You can see here the Shaper damage can get pretty meaty, and for Shaper I don't even bother going 4 DPS flasks. I just run Quicksilver because it's just that much easier to actually survive against, and the Wise Oak damage is definitely a bit of an overkill and not something you actually need to do. It's just a 4 DPS flasks, is a bit of an overkill. Taste of Hate or Wise Oak, they both do about the same amount of damage for the build. It's just whether or not you can afford a Taste of Hate, because it should be defensively stronger while maintaining a strong offense as well. So what I am saying is that the character can have, here's an Elder for no reason whatsoever. Don't know why I even fit this in, because he's bit of a joke compared to the rest of the content I've showed you anyway. What I was trying to say is that the build at its core is 2 Poet's Pens. I do show you and will show you all of the actual gear and everything that goes into the character in a minute, but it's really just Poet's Pens, and then how expensive and how well you want to craft the rest of the character is entirely up to you. It's not necessarily going to be super expensive, but you can make it pretty expensive. You can do some pretty tricky things and beef a character like this one all the way up to the sky and have a very strong character for endgame mapping. And the only issue that I've come across so far is basically this here, and that's Atsiri, Uber Atsiri, with her 1% reflect. Even with the Yugal reflect thing, she hurts quite a bit when I hit her with my own skills, so it's a bit tricky to maintain a good life balance for when you get hit by spears. You will die when you're a low enough health from the reflect. And I do decide to go completely balls deep just by standing still and seeing what it looks like without, dodging, without tapering myself off for the attacks. And it definitely doesn't work out, which is an example of this in a second. But otherwise, guys, I do want to show you the entire character, how I built it, and basically a full guide about the Poet's Pens build. So it is a currently level 92 Pathfinder, and the reason I went Pathfinder is mostly just for the movement speed, bit of attack speed where I want it, and the strength of the flasks with the penetration from Veteran Bowyer for, our current cold spells and all of that. And it's just making the flasks a lot stronger, so your Series Promise, your Taste of Hate, and your Quicksilver. So since we don't really have a very good movement skill, you do want to beef up your Quicksilver and your run speed for the most part so that it feels good to play. And then just the pure sustain of flasks makes this very enjoyable in the end game especially. But I do largely need to talk about Poet Pens themselves. So you can see there's pretty, basic stuff on there. 3 levels to your socketed gem by level 75, so currently level 23 Cascade, for example. Gain a bunch of physical onto the actual weapon itself, so your frenzy hits a bit harder, which is pretty irrelevant. You're not really going to be doing much damage there. Bit of attack speed, and then trigger a socketed spell when you attack. Now what that means is whenever you attack with your wanding skill, with your wanding attack, you will be triggering a spell that is sitting inside the Poet's Pen. Currently I have Glacial Cascade in one and Bladefall sitting in the other. Now you cannot have, for example, Cascade in both of them because it shares a cooldown, so you'll only be triggering one Cascade at a time, whereas when you're using one Cascade and one Bladefall, you're hitting with both because they don't share a cooldown at all. And the way this works is currently we use Frenzy, so that's our attack. You don't have to even use Frenzy, you can just use default attack and that'll still work. But use Frenzy because it's, you can link it up and it gives you Frenzy charges as you actually attack. So it's pretty useful for the triggering of the skill. And it currently has a 0.25 second cooldown, so you can get, let's say, 4 maximum spells in per second. And you can see that down here in this Glacial Cascade icon. That's going to be this one over here. As soon as you attack, it goes on cooldown and then refreshes almost immediately because 0.25 seconds worth of cooldown, meaning you try and get 4 in, meaning you try and not get your attack speed past a certain point. If you get your attack speed to about 0.25, 0.26, so you can fit in 4 attacks a second, it should roughly get you 4 attacks a second. If you get underneath that and start attacking at 0.24, you attack again before the cooldown of the Cascade is back up, and thus you won't get your triggering spell off, and you skip a spell. So you really don't want to get underneath 0.25 because that will start interrupting your spells, and I can visualize that for you guys here. So whenever you attack, you do have the little cooldown and it comes back up, and if you're attacking constantly and getting constant procs, it should have a very nice refresh rate. For example, right now I have 0.39 attacks per second, so that's about 2.5 attacks per second at the moment. So it's not a very high proc rate, but you can see as it refreshes, I can attack and it will come back up instantly, pretty comfortably. Whenever we, let's say, press our flask for attack speed and onslaught flask, that's about 40% attack speed gain. We move up to 0.3 attack time, and it still goes faster, but we're still keeping up with the cooldown time. If, for example, I have faster attacks attached to my frenzy as well, we're currently at 0.29. Now we're at 0.24, so now we're underneath the threshold we want to be at, and you can see what happens when that happens. Pay attention to the cascade over here. It's not refreshing as well because you are getting a second attack in before it is refreshed quite often, and thus you're getting less procs than you otherwise would when you're over that 0.25 cap. So once again at 0.29, it's refreshing really nicely, really quickly. You press your extra attack speed and all of a sudden it slows down a bit. Now the cool thing about Poet's Pens that stands them apart from a Cospre's, for example, or any other cast on crit before, is that it triggers when you attack. So you don't have to actually hit anything, you don't have to crit anything to get any of your procs off, so you can stand back and shoot and get your procs off really comfortably and gives you a smooth playstart. But on top of that, it lets you use other skills like Body Swap, for example, and Unearth. So that's a pretty popular combo with Poet's Pen right now, where you're running around unearthing things and then body swapping immediately. So you can do a good bunch of traveling around, and you don't actually need any interaction from critting, corpses, any of that. So you start right-clicking, and all of a sudden you are creating corpses and then teleporting to them through the body swap mechanic. It's something, I've played around with a bit, but it's not really my cup of tea. It feels a bit too hectic and a bit too annoying, just, constantly porting around. Didn't feel as effective to me either as, Cascade and Bladefall together. So that's the combo that I've set upon. But alternatively, a lot of people have been using Volatile Dead as well. So as part of their combo, so you're still creating corpses and then you're still getting volatile deads off, so like that. And it has become a very effective boss killer because you can wind up a lot of these before you run into a boss and then they instantly blow them up. And there's going to be plenty of those versions out there for you guys to copy if that's something you want to do, but my version specifically will be focused on Cascade and just Bladefall. Now, even in my version, you can just chuck in a body swap throughout the actual, setup, just replace a Cascade or a Bladefall, and still get a bunch of extra fun body swap charging around the map sort of mechanic. But I just, for the most part, didn't really like doing that too much and preferred to run around at a fairly fast pace anyway, but entirely up to you guys where you take your Poet's Pen character. It is a very fun leveling setup, if nothing else, before you get your Cascade, before you get your Bladefall, since you can get Body Swap at level 12 and Unearth at around the same level, I think. So all in all, it is a decent leveling setup and probably the fastest leveling setup you can do for your character, since you won't have much movement speed at that point. So it's worth playing around with, and so are lots of other spells. Entirely up to you guys what spells you go for. Figure out some different combos. They definitely have a lot to do, and doesn't have to be Glacial Cascade and Bladefall or Unearth and Volatile Dead. There's a lot to do with these weapons. But in any case, about my actual character, now that I've explained Poet's Pens, the actual character itself I'll go over in total now, and the setups I'm running are Glacial Cascade, Bladefall, and then another Glacial Cascade in the chest. So the Glacial Cascade in the chest is attached to Frenzy, Cast on Crit, Hypothermia, Increased Crit Strikes, and then my 6th link was going to be Conk Effect, and that's what I just then put in because I only just 6th linked it recently. It's not even very important to have a 6th link or even a 5 link on this. You're not going to get too much damage out of this setup because Cast on Crit itself has a half a second cooldown as opposed to these, which have a 0.25 second cooldown. And on top of that, it relies on you critting and hitting, which my crit and hit isn't very good. As you can see here, 76% hit, and you're going to have about 50-60% crit buffed up. So it's not going to be anywhere near as reliable a damage source as your Poet's Pens. So the 6th link really isn't that important. And the chest I went for, I just grabbed a shaped chest with eye level 80 at least, I think. Something like that, maybe 84. And that's just to chaos spam and get spells have 1 to 1.5% critical strike chance. Because my Cascade only has 5%, my Bladefall only has 5% base, the extra 1.5 goes a very long way to getting your damage up. So I just grabbed an evasion chest, spammed it until I got spell crit and a bit of life. Got fairly lucky to get a decent life roll. 80 to 89, and then I just exalted on a hybrid, so it ended up being a really nice chest, but it doesn't have to be anywhere near this good. Doesn't even have to be this chest, you can run different chests altogether, but I figured this was my best bet for good damage and filling out my crit. And then the Poet's Pens themselves have Glacial Cascade, Hypothermia, and Bladefall and Controlled Destruction, and then I run basically a mishmash of stuff. Over here I run an increased area and then subbing in a conk effect for single target, and over here I run either Spell Cascade if it's a really big open map and needs lots of extra blade falls happening, like so, or a crit strikes or an increased area, and then once again a conk effect for single target. So Control Destruction and Conk Effect over here, and then Hypothermia and Conk Effect over here for single target. So we do have 3 Conk Effects that way when we're going pure single target. Now the rest of the gear I feel is pretty loose in terms of requirements. I'm running Tomb Fists purely because I wanted to fit in a few more Abyssal Jewels, but they're really not that important. They don't add too much damage to our build overall. Because the flat spells isn't that important towards these types of spells, these types of skills, but I figured it was my best bet to squeeze out as most damage as I could. Otherwise, rare gloves really are fine. We're not making use of the Intimidate on these gloves because it's for attack based only, so that doesn't matter at all. And you can see here, let's say Cascade is 19.4. If I take out one of my pretty decent jewels over here, it's down to 19.1. It's 300 DPS. It's really quite meaningless to have 2 socket gloves over here. It's just, so I can get a decent combo of life and then a bit of extra damage as well. Not terribly important. The belt, I was running an Abyssal 2 socket belt for a while, but overall, like I said, not that important. So we just got a life one with some reduced flask charges, and then stuck another Abyssal Jewel in there, which is a really good one. It's about as good as you could possibly get for this build, but still not that important on the damage anyway. The boots, as you can see, just a bunch of life, movement speed, and resist. Chaos spam these myself. The chaos resist, not too important, but it is nice to have. For the most part, you're looking for high movement speed since we don't have a good movement skill. So the more movement speed you can get, the faster you can run around in maps. The ring I have here, I wanted to get diamonds on both, but this diamond just has some life and fills out some of the resist and strength that I need for the build. And this ring over here is my Warlords mark on hit ring. Now don't be intimidated by this one, it's not important at all. The Herald of Ice over here barely does anything. It barely adds damage, it barely adds clear speed. You could very easily take off Herald of Ice and put in a Warlords mark Blasphemy. I just simply built around this ring to begin with, and currently have the resists and all that. So I'm not going to try and replace it, but you could easily just get a diamond ring similar to this one and instead run a Warlord's mark without really losing anything in that scenario. And then I grabbed a circlet, just bought this one straight up, some life, some fizz to spells. Once again, not terribly important. If you can get a Glacial Cascade Helm enchant instead, that'd probably be a lot better. But I bought this one, didn't get an actual Helm enchant because just trying to save a bit of money there. And then I did go ahead and buy a fairly interesting Shaper Amulet. Now this one cost 70 chaos, they apparently aren't too steep, or you could try and craft your own, but the important stuff here is the crit multi and then physical damages extra cold damage. So it is a good boost of damage. It's half of a hatred, for example, let's just say, which is pretty big. But what you're looking for there is the crit multi specifically, some good life, and then the extra cold, Fizz's extra cold. I ran an amulet without it for, 85 levels or so, 88 even, and it's not a big deal at all. It's just a bit of extra damage if you're going to try and squeeze it in everywhere you can. Like I said, you can craft it yourself. I came across 3 amulets with a roll of crit multi and fizz to cold, and then just slap a life on there, and it's not too big a deal. But this is the best one that I thought was for the most reasonable amount of money, and that's why I bought it at 70C. Now for our flasks, of course, a Quicksilver with movement speed on it, and a Theory Flask gives us a lot of damage. Not actually running a Onslaught at all because it was pushing me over my attack speed threshold. So I was running a Diamond Flask with Curse, and then for the most part I was running a Wise Oak with my Cold Resist overbuffed, so that's what the penetration I was getting. But I did buy a Taste of Hate, and for the most part that is going to be a better thing to run. instead of the Wise Oak for just pure defensiveness and damage. And then if you really want the extra damage, you sub the Wise Oak in over the Quicksilver during certain fights, but it's really not necessary, at least not in my stage of damaging gear. Wasn't at all necessary, and I usually preferred having the Quicksilver in for the utility and the movement speed. It is a lot more damage. It's another like 20% more damage if you have a Wise Oak in, so keep that in mind. It is a big damage flask, but not having a Quicksilver is a bit of a kick in the nuts. Now I do just have to go over one last little setup here. That's the Orb of Storms attached to Arcane Surge and Power Charge on crit. That's where I was getting a lot of my power charges from. Just before every pack, I'd pretty much drop an Orb of Storms, as well as that getting Arcane Surge. And then we got our Ice Golem up here too. I then ran Herald of Ice down here with Frost Bomb and Increased Duration and Vile Haste. Vile Haste you do not press during boss fights, or at least I don't, because I am balanced around having my attack speed without Vile Haste. If I press Vile Haste during a boss fight, I will go underneath 0.25, and then I will start skipping spells. So I rarely, if ever, used Vile Haste for boss fights. Just usually for map clear and all of that. You can use Vile Haste for some boss fights when you know you won't be standing still attacking all the time, when sometimes you'll be attacking and moving a bit, because at that point getting 0.25 doesn't really matter. You'll be moving around anyway. So bear that in mind when you're going through your attack speed caps and all of that. And the Frost Bomb, it's another 20% minus cold underneath enemies, so place it underneath bosses strategically as you can, and it should give you a good damage boost. And then over here is Hatred and a Flame Dash. And lastly, the passive tree itself, it did go under a few revisions to optimize it, and that was largely around jewel sockets at this point. So if you can get decent enough jewel sockets with 3 good stats, now that's life, damage, or just 3 damage, then it's worth building into some jewel sockets, which is why I have 1, 2, 3, 4 over here, I think. And then the flask nodes up here, some crit multi, a bit of crit. We do have the fizz nodes up here, which are pretty big for the build. Some fizz down here, yep, good jewels. And then around here, another jewel. Over here, some life. I'm still filling out this one more life point for level 93, which should hit me about 5,700. And then this over here is for converting our last bit of Glacial Cascade damage and a bit of our Bladefall damage. So it's not hugely important, but it is a damage gain because physical damage itself is still good, and I don't have huge amounts of elemental damage scaling that it's super important to get all of the conversion happening. So that's roughly the entire character and everything I need to say. I think it should be a good one for Pathfinder as an ascendancy to pretty much do anything with Poet's Pen. However, you can do, let's say, a Scion or an Inquisitor just as well, maybe even some Assassins. Poet's Pens are a very flexible item, and if they don't get nerfed, which I'm not sure they should, they were released by GGG pretty recently, and they do exactly what they're supposed to do. So I don't see why they'd get a nerf. You can then very easily play this stuff on just about anything, and do whatever the hell you want with them. As for a league starter, that will be tough because a lot of people are going to be going for these, and I do imagine they're going to be pretty expensive at the start of a league. If you can get your hands on 1, maybe even 2, then probably worth it, but bear in mind, to make it worthwhile, you pretty much need to be using 2. If you're only using 1, you're only getting half the output of the character, so not terribly worth it. In any case, guys, hope you enjoyed the video and the build. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.